retrospect, the warning signs were there from the very beginning. The rent was absurdly low for the area. The landlord seemed almost desperate to get someone moved in as quickly as possible. The entire process from touring the apartment to signing the lease to carrying in the first box took less than a single week. Flora had never rented her own place before, but even she understood that nothing that good ever comes without a catch. Still, apartment 311 felt like a blessing at first. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, pristine condition, already furnished with a handful of paintings on the walls so the place didn't feel hollow or cold. Flora converted the second bedroom into a home office and settled into her new life with quiet satisfaction. The only thing she couldn't quite explain was a smell, faint, occasional, drifting through the living room like something left forgotten in a corner. Musty, not overpowering, just present. She told herself it was an old building. She told herself it was nothing. The strangeness began small, the way it always does. Knickknacks moved to the wrong shelves. Snacks she was sure she'd bought disappearing from the kitchen. The refrigerator door found open in the morning when she was certain she'd closed it the night before. Always while she was asleep. Always while the door was bolted shut from the inside. Flora was not a woman prone to panic, so she convinced herself she was sleepwalking. She'd always been a restless sleeper, night terrors, bad dreams, a mind that refused to quiet itself in the dark. Moving to a new place had only made it worse. She told herself it was stress. She told herself she was imagining things. What she could not explain away was the sleep paralysis. It had happened to her before, that horrible sensation of waking inside a body that refused to move. Eyes open, lungs struggling, familiar and unpleasant. What had never happened before was the hallucinations. They started around the same time the food began disappearing. She woke in the night and couldn't move. The room was dark except for the pale silver light coming through the curtains. She tried to calm herself, tried to breathe slowly, to remind herself that this had happened before and it would pass. But something was different this time. Something felt wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. Then she saw the bedroom door opening. Slowly, inch by inch, the door swung inward. She could hear the soft creak of the hinges, deliberate and careful, the way a person moves when they do not want to be heard. A face peered around the edge of the door, bald, pale, with skin that looked dry and flaking even from across the room. His eyes caught the faint moonlight and reflected it back at her like polished stone, and he was smiling. Not the smile of someone amused or happy, but a fixed, forced thing, teeth clenched together and grinding slowly. Yellow and chipped, stretching across his face in a way that looked more like a wound than an expression. He stepped fully into the room. He was impossibly thin, not the thinness of someone who had missed meals, but the thinness of someone who had been slowly disappearing for a long time. His body was covered in sores. His skin was gray. He was naked, smeared with dirt, and he moved with the slow, deliberate care of someone who had done this many times before. He crossed the room with agonizing patience, leaning down until his face was inches from hers, his breath washing over her in a wave of that same musty smell she had noticed in the living room, closer and stronger and unmistakably human. He stood there, staring at her. For what felt like an hour, he simply stared, and she could feel something radiating off of him that she could only describe as hatred, cold and specific and deeply personal. The way you hate something that has wronged you. Then he straightened, turned around, and crept back out of the room, pulling the door softly shut behind him. Flora called in sick to work the next morning. She searched every room, every closet, every space beneath the sink. She found nothing. She convinced herself, because she needed to, that it had been a hallucination, a particularly vivid episode of sleep paralysis, nothing more. She was wrong, and some part of her already knew it. The episodes continued. Every week, reliably, she would wake in the dark and find herself paralyzed, and he would be there. She gave him a name, Jimmy, because giving something a silly name is one of the oldest and most human ways of making it smaller, of taking the shape of your fear and filing its edges down into something you can bear to look at. Jimmy never touched her, never sat on her chest, never reached for her throat. He simply stood and watched with that same grinding smile. and eventually left. As sleep paralysis hallucinations went, she told herself Jimmy wasn't so bad. At least he was consistent. Then she found the photograph. It was tucked beneath a stack of papers, a picture of two women she didn't recognize, embracing in front of a waterfall. A previous tenant must have left it behind. Flora texted the landlord, got a number, and called. The woman who answered sounded tired. Her name was Rebecca, and when Flora explained why she was calling just returning a forgotten photograph, nothing more the exhaustion in her voice shifted into something harder to name. She asked if things had been going missing. She described a naked man, covered in sores, barely more than a corpse, standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night. Her girlfriend had seen him. The police had come and found nothing. They had tried a cleansing ritual, and it hadn't worked. Eventually, they had simply left. Flora hung up the phone. She sat on the couch for a long time after that, staring at one of the paintings on the wall, a woman in a white dress, sitting beneath a tree, reading a book. There was something about that painting she couldn't quite place, some nagging pull of attention she couldn't explain. She shook it off and went to her office to research. What she found chilled her more than anything that had come before. The tenant before Rebecca, a man named Michael Hansen, had been reported missing 6 months ago. A coworker had filed the report. Flora pulled up the photograph attached to the article and stopped breathing. It was Jimmy, younger, healthier, not yet hollowed out by whatever had happened to him, but undeniably the same person. Michael Hansen had lived in apartment 311. Michael Hansen had vanished, and whatever remained of Michael Hansen had never left. Flora packed a bag and went to stay with a friend, citing a roach infestation. She slept soundly for the first time in weeks. She spent the next 2 days reading everything she could find about restless spirits folklore, forums, paranormal accounts. Most of what she found was contradictory, but one idea kept surfacing across different sources and different centuries. A spirit could be bound to an object, tethered to the physical world through something that had belonged to them in life. Destroy the object, and the soul is freed. She thought about the paintings. She went back to the apartment with a cardboard box and a plan. One by one, she pulled the paintings from the walls, stacking them carefully. She had lighter fluid at home. There was an empty lot 2 blocks away. She had already rehearsed in her mind how it would go: a small fire, a freed spirit, and then she could sleep again. She reached the last painting, the woman in the white dress, sitting beneath her tree. She pulled it from the wall. The musty smell hit her immediately, stronger than she had ever noticed it, concentrated and close. Behind the painting was a hole in the wall, small, rectangular, roughly 2 feet across, and positioned low, maybe 4 feet from the floor. The kind of space a person could fit inside if they were thin enough, if they had made themselves thin enough. Flora raised her flashlight and looked inside. She ran from the apartment without stopping, without looking back, calling the police from the street with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She had been prepared to find a body. She had steeled herself for death and decay, and the remains of Michael Hansen hidden in the walls by some unknown killer. She had not been prepared to find him still there, still alive, still smiling that fixed and grinding smile, crouched in the hollow space behind her living room wall, staring back at her with those same pale eyes that had watched her sleep every week for months. He hadn't been a ghost at all. Mark had always thought the worst thing about his wife, Sarah, was how quiet she was. She had a habit, unsettling, but something he had come to accept, the way you accept the particular sounds a house makes at night, of standing in the doorway of their bedroom while he slept. He would wake at 3 in the morning with the particular prickling sensation of being watched, open his eyes, and find her silhouette in the dark doorway. When he asked what she was doing, she would smile softly and whisper the same thing every time. "Just making sure you're still here." He had chalked it up to anxiety, to the strange ways that love sometimes expresses itself in people who have been hurt before. He had chosen not to be afraid of it. That choice became harder to make as things got worse. Sarah stopped eating dinner with him. She would sit across the table with her hands folded, watching him chew each bite with an attention that felt clinical, almost scientific. The food started tasting different, bitter, chemical, like something added that didn't belong. When he coughed, her eyes would snap to his throat and stay there. She asked if something was wrong in a voice that didn't sound like her voice, a voice that sounded like a careful approximation of concern produced by something that had studied concern but never felt it. He started waking up with bruises on his wrists. When he showed them to her, she wept and pushed up her sleeves to show him identical marks on her own skin. She told him someone was breaking in while they slept, that she could feel them in the dark, that she fought them off, that she had been trying to protect him. She held him close while she cried, and he wanted desperately to believe her. He stopped believing her the night he pretended to sleep. He kept his eyes nearly shut, breathing slowly and deliberately, watching through his eyelashes as she got out of bed, crossed to his side, and stood over him for 10 full minutes without moving. Then she raised her own hands to her own throat and pressed down. He watched her squeeze until her face reddened and her skin marked, until she had manufactured the evidence of violence that had not occurred. Then she lowered her hands and went back to bed. The realization that followed was methodical and horrible. The bitter taste in the food, the hidden kitchen knives he kept discovering in wrong places, the bruises, the nighttime vigils. She was constructing a story, a careful, patient story in which Mark was the monster and she was the victim, so that when the ending came, it would look like self-defense. His wife was planning to kill him, and she had been planning it for a long time. The night he decided he could not wait any longer, his stomach was burning from dinner, and he could hear her downstairs in the dark kitchen, whispering to herself in a voice too low to understand. He reached for the heavy metal flashlight on his nightstand. He told himself it was him or her. He told himself he had no choice. He crept down the stairs in silence and found her standing with her back to him, face to the open refrigerator, muttering. He did not give her the chance to turn around. She dropped to the floor and didn't move. Mark stood over her, breathing hard, shaking. Then the pain he had been ignoring all evening crashed over him in a wave, and he fell to his knees, retching black fluid onto the kitchen floor. He needed to call for help. He needed to tell someone what she had done to him, what he had found out, what he had been forced to do. He pulled out his phone, and the light from the screen fell across the kitchen table. There was a notebook open there. Sarah's handwriting filled the page. He read it. She had written to her mother. The words described a man whose mind was breaking down, a brain injury from a car accident months ago, a diagnosis of rapid cognitive deterioration, a husband who walked through the house at night without knowing it, who strangled his wife in his sleep and forgot by morning, who had begun, in his confusion, to poison his own food and blame her for it. She had been spitting the food out into napkins. She had been trying to protect him. She loved him and she could not leave him, and she was terrified every single night. Mark's phone fell from his hand. The accident. He remembered the accident. He remembered the doctor's visits, the words he hadn't wanted to hear, the diagnosis he had tucked somewhere deep and refused to examine, the bitter taste of the food he had cooked himself tonight, the bruises from hands he could not remember raising, the woman lying unconscious on the kitchen floor who had done nothing wrong except love someone whose mind was quietly coming apart. The kitchen light clicked on. Sarah was still unconscious. She had not moved. Mark looked at the wall switch. Standing beside it was a man, impossibly thin, gray-skinned, wearing clothes identical to the ones Mark had put on that morning. A twisted, rotten reflection of himself, grinning with a smile that went far too wide, that had too many teeth, that belonged to nothing living. "Good job, Mark," the thing whispered, in a voice like dry paper folding against itself. "She was starting to notice me. Now, who should we blame for this?" The edges of Mark's vision were already going dark, the poison and the grief and the horror pulling him under. But even as he fell, the understanding came. Sarah had not been the monster. He had not merely been sick. Every night when he stood in that doorway watching her sleep, he had not been alone. Something had been there with him, something that had been using his broken mind as a door left open, walking through him and into their home, night after night after night. And then the front door opened. Footsteps in the hallway, heavy, familiar, tired. "Sarah? Mark?" a voice called from the dark. "I'm finally home from the hospital. The traffic was awful." It was his voice, exactly his voice, coming from someone standing in the hallway he could no longer turn his head to see. The gray thing by the light switch stopped smiling. Its eyes went wide with something that looked genuinely like fear. It looked down at Mark on the floor, then toward the hallway, then back at Mark again, and across its ruined face moved an expression of slow and dawning horror. "There's 3 of us," it whispered. Felicia Martinez had been an urban explorer for years before the house on 5th Street appeared. She had walked through abandoned sanitariums and shuttered hospitals, empty schools and dead malls, places that had been built for human life and then left behind, and she had always found something beautiful in them, a particular quality of silence, a sense of time suspended, the uncanny feeling of standing somewhere that was meant to be occupied and no longer was. She knew how to read a building. She knew when something was wrong. The house on 5th Street was wrong before she even walked through the door. It hadn't been there the day before. Not in the way that construction gets finished overnight. Not in the way that you sometimes stop noticing something until one day you do. It simply had not existed, and then it did. Gothic in style, squeezed into a space between neighboring buildings that should not have been able to contain it. Foreclosure sign on the wall. Every window boarded shut, the lawn brown and long dead. She looked it up online, pulled up satellite imagery, checked street-level photographs. In every record she could find, the space where the house now stood had contained either a different building or nothing at all. There was no construction history, no permit records, no listing. The house had appeared from nowhere and inserted itself into the street as though it had always been there. She knew, even then, that she should leave it alone. She packed her gear and went at night. Flashlight, spare batteries, water, pepper spray, phone, first aid kit. She stood on the front step with that wrong feeling pressing against her from all sides, like magnetic repulsion, like her body understood something her mind was still catching up to, and she pushed open the door. It opened without resistance. The knob didn't turn because the knob wasn't functional. Just a piece of painted wood shaped to look like hardware. Inside, the air smelled not of mold or decay, but of something new, synthetic, almost chemical. The walls were dark carved panels, the floor polished hardwood, a staircase rising to the 2nd floor, several doors leading further in. Surprisingly well preserved, surprisingly intact. Felicia picked a door at random and went through it. The dining room held a long table surrounded by wooden chairs. A painting on the far wall showed the exterior of the house she was currently standing in, which struck her as eccentric but not alarming. What alarmed her was the chairs. When she tried to pull one closer, it didn't move. She knelt down to examine it and realized she could find no seam between the chair legs and the floor. No joint, no bracket, no evidence that they had ever been separate objects. The chair appeared to have grown out of the floor. The table, too. Everything in the room was a single, continuous piece of carved wood, as if the furniture and the building that contained it had been formed together from one enormous block. The library was the same. Shelves packed with volumes, but every spine was blank, and none of the books could be removed from the shelves. They were part of the shelf. The shelf was part of the wall. The wall was part of the house, and the house was all one thing. She muttered to herself in the quiet, trying to reason through what she was seeing. And then, a door behind her began to open. She spun around, with the pepper spray raised and the flashlight aimed at whatever was coming through the doorway. What she saw made her scream. It was roughly human in shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but only roughly. Its surface looked like clay or putty, that had been pressed into the approximate form of a person. Its clothes, not clothing at all, but simply part of whatever material it was made from. Its face a nearly blank surface with shallow indentations suggesting where features should be. A bump for a nose, a crease where a mouth might go, hollows where eyes should be. Its head pulsed and deflated with each movement, as though something inside it was breathing. Its hands were fingerless lumps. Felicia sprayed it directly in the face. It didn't react. It stumbled toward her with the clumsy, uncertain gait of something that had not quite figured out how legs were supposed to work, and she ran. The front door was gone. Where the entryway had been was now a solid wall with a painting on it. The house again, viewed from the street, exactly like the one in the dining room. She grabbed the frame and pulled, and it was like grabbing part of the building itself, immovable. Already she could hear the shuffling footsteps behind her. She ran for the stairs. The second floor was a maze of identical corridors, stretching further than the exterior could possibly contain. Every door was the same door. Every painting was the same painting. She ran until her lungs burned and the corridors kept generating themselves ahead of her. More hallways, more identical doors, some real, some carved into the wall and opening into nothing. She found a spiral staircase descending into darkness with no visible bottom, ascending into distance she couldn't measure. When the faceless thing shuffled around the corner behind her, she waited, ducked under its reaching arms, and kicked it hard over the railing. She watched it fall until it was too small to see and still hadn't hit anything. She tried to rest. She found a bedroom, 4-poster bed, wooden blankets that were rigid and cold, pillows that were solid wood shaped to look soft. She fell asleep despite herself and woke to the sensation of the floor growing over her legs, the wood spreading and hardening around her like a slow tide coming in. She wrenched herself free and kept moving. She kept moving because she had understood, by that point, what the house was. When she found a knot window, a panel of wood that emitted light the way deep-sea creatures emit light, bioluminescent and sourceless, she dug into it with the metal scissors from her first aid kit. The wood gave way after several minutes of work. Behind it was flesh, pink and wet and unmistakably organic, weeping red when her scissors pierced it. Not wood at all, chitin, the exoskeleton of something alive. She was not inside a house, she was inside a living thing. She kept moving because stopping meant being absorbed. She moved through corridors that began to violate geometry, 6-way intersections, hallways running at 90-degree angles to the floor, rooms that combined other rooms without logic. She passed more stairwells. Something fell past one at terminal velocity, and she suspected she knew what it was. She found the backpack jutting from the floor, half absorbed, being slowly digested into the architecture. She ripped it free. Inside were granola bars, a soda, a sketchbook, and pencils. She ate and she drank, and she tried not to think about the hand she saw next to where the backpack had been, the faint outline of a human form visible through the floor, another victim in the slow process of becoming part of whatever she was trapped inside. The first page of the sketchbook had a date on it. She had entered the building in 2015. The date in the sketchbook was 2022. She sat with that for a long time. Then she began to write. The house was a predator, an extra-dimensional organism that bent space to insert itself into a location, mimicking the appearance of a structure to lure people inside. It could only imitate wood, which was why everything inside had the same texture. Once something living entered, it sent those faceless things to chase the prey until exhaustion set in, until the victim stopped moving and was absorbed. She had no way of knowing how many people had walked through that door. 2,700 missing persons cases go unsolved every year in the United States alone. She tore the pages from the sketchbook and carried them to the next stairwell she found. She rolled them tight and dropped them into the dark. "If you're reading this," she wrote, "it means the house has an exit somewhere. It means something I wrote found its way out. And it means the house on 5th Street is real, and it is still out there, and it will appear again in some street in some city where someone with too much curiosity and not enough fear will see it and think the same thing she thought.